Welcome to
Recalculating.
the podcast about spiritual detours.
Honest doubt and the unexpected clarity
that comes from questioning the path you're
Grew up
on.
with one way to believe,
one way to belong.
one version of God, one direction.
And somewhere along the line, the road signs
Stopped matching the destination.
And I had a choice.
I could keep relying on the map that had me driving in circles or start asking some different questions. A quick note before we begin, and I was not asked to do this. I didn't even ask if I could do this. I hope it's cool. But another former Adventist content creator, Melissa Spears, has a memoir releasing in the spring through Lake Drive Books. Now, Lake Drive Books is a publisher, gives a lot of freedom and partnership with their authors, and there is a Kickstarter crowdfunding project that's going to go for marketing and pushing the book into the world. I'm adding a link to the show notes if you would like to check that out and help bring that to life. There's a week or two left in that campaign, so hop over there and do whatever you see fit. Now, back to my conversation with Luka. Picking up directly from where we were last week in the discussion of what makes a good Adventist kid, we move on to discuss Luka's journey toward a good Adventist adult, specifically an Adventist woman. Now, that presented a particular challenge, as that label just wasn't going to fit, as Luka was beginning to realize their gender just wasn't so simple. When we first recorded this, it became clear to me that our discussion on gender and religion, fundamentalist religions, needed its own space. That's what this episode is. Luka's journey of self-exploration and gender identity, while also managing the tensions of parents locked into an unequally yoked marriage when divorce really wasn't an option. In the midst of this discussion of self-discovery, Luka and I explore the Adventist tendency to avoid social justice issues, how things like racism or inequality get dismissed as private flaws that we need to get used to instead of systemic realities we should confront. We talk about the interesting space that Luka found for their gender expression, even within Adventism, and how its call to be peculiar, to mark ourselves through our modesty and separation, gave space to mute femininity without drawing immediate suspicion. Luka also discusses connecting with their indigenous heritage and the two-spirit traditions of indigenous cultures. We talk about the science and experiences of intersex people in a black and white gender system. And I think in the world we are living in right now, the trans and non-binary experience is far too maligned and scapegoated in our society, and particularly in fundamentalist circles like conservative Adventism. Luka's honesty and openness on these topics simply demanded its own lane. I'm going to stop wasting your time and get right on into it. This is
Recalculating.
I've heard of homes where there was one Adventist parent and the other parent was something else, always. But to have have them both in and one leave while the kids are at home is such an interesting perspective I've never come across. There has to be some really conflicting ways the bubble wanted to raise the group of kids versus what your dad was getting into or learning about from not being in the Levitical diet, not being in however conservative the area was it Bering Springs? Is that what you said?
It was, but we later moved to Battle Creek. So, even more of like an Adventist Mecca.
Yeah. Ooh. Jeez. This is it.
And I say Mecca because when I was a child, I attended the Battle Creek Tabernacle Church. And that was the church that anybody that was coming from out of town to visit, for anybody not aware, Battle Creek has the historic Adventist village with Ellen White's actual home on it. And there's the sanitarium that Kellogg worked at. There's Ellen White's gravestone. There's Kellogg's gravestone. There's a lot of like physical history smack dab in the city. And people would come from out of country and they would always like have their lunch there at the tab. And because of that, we had potluck like every week no matter what, because people would come, just sometimes even buses of people. And they'd be this time they're from Brazil and they're all going to go right after, or this time they're just from like Alaska or Indiana or wherever. Yeah, always. And that really, I don't know, it enhanced the idea of like Adventism is all around you. And honestly, the church community around me was very comfortable with kind of my dad being out of the picture. It was this weird thing where it's like not appropriate for my mom to get divorced from my dad, but in every other way, it was appropriate for my mom to approach life as a single mother because his opinion wasn't valid anymore. And because he knew the truth at one point, it was actually extra nefarious if he started discussing like religion with the children. So
Yeah, so he's both dangerous to be around, but also you can't divorce him.
yeah. So it's good when he's never showing up for anything, almost. You know, like they would mention, like, it's sad he's not here, but it was
But better.
always the assumption was if he was there, he was a member again or working toward it. And I really think that added to him not wanting to be in Adventist spaces because people
Yeah,
would start trying to, like, pull him back in every time he would show up.
sure. Because yeah, that's either their one opportunity to win him back, or to be extra skeptical of him as a like rogue agent. You know,
Basically, yeah. He would get a Bible study offer, and then he would get a deacon talking to him, like sizing him up at the same,
yeah.
10-minute pass.
I mean, that's how I feel now in in
Ugh,
Adventist
yeah.
spaces, or not even Adventist spaces, just with people, Adventists I grew up with, of like, hey, let's have dinner, or let's have lunch. I'm like, oh man, are we just having lunch, or
Mm-hmm.
is this a low key inspection of how horrifically sinful I'm living my life now, or is this a pitch to try to like get me back or whatever? Because no, it's such an interesting thing because I try to be the same. Like, if I've known you forever, I've known you forever. I understand the reason we knew each other was a thing that I don't necessarily agree with anymore. But like, that doesn't have to affect how we have a conversation. But I also know, I know they have to, if they're not trying to win me back, I'd almost be offended. Like, it's not
Yeah,
gonna
like
work.
you're past the point of no return.
But yeah, don't believe I'm so far gone. I'm so evil. It is a weird line to toe. That's so interesting.
Yeah, for me, that line was very easily discernible because for any of the audience that might not be aware, I'm transgender and I grew up as a little girl and then suddenly, over time I stop attending and then rumors start going around that, I am trans now and looking more like a guy. And I actually had a church member at my grandma's funeral come up to me and like she had to be pointed out who I was, like where I was, because she was looking for me, but she couldn't find me in the crowd. And then she came up to me, and basically it kind of boiled down to like, you look different, and just kind of like waiting for me to like speak it into existence. And
Sure.
I was just like, okay. But like truly after that, going down that road and like not even just outward signs like for Adventists that can be as simple as like brightly colored dyed hair, non-natural hair color.
Mm.
That kind of ties in with being worldly enough that like in my case like suddenly all the invitations stopped. Like before I would get like I got a care package randomly in the mail with like nutritional yeast and nuts and seeds in it, all this stuff, and then never to hear from that individual again. And I don't take it as like, oh, I've been shunned so much because I didn't ever really feel accepted by the community. Like you, I've been trying to kind of be the same version of myself or as much as I can be and like talk with people as I grow into different versions of myself. If I see them, on social media and we are still in the same area, or I run into people, I still keep in touch with them. I still keep in touch with some people from academy and from my K through 12 years as well. But all of them have also left the church. It's not a requirement for me, but they all just seem to be leaving. Yeah.
I do wonder if there's more of that in the academy scene than like I feel like a lot of questions I think I would have had them earlier if I was surrounded with other Adventists talking about it all the time. But it was like anytime I talked about Adventism in the public school setting, I was pitching it. I
Okay,
never
yeah.
really had to think about it. It was just, this is what I think. And it was never, hey, you and I both think this. Have you ever thought about where this thought came from or where this belief came? Like I never had to go that extra step. It was always a selling point, not something I was investigating. And so I wonder if people that are around it all the time and get to have those conversations, because you don't have to spend a week talking about Daniel and Revelation just to catch someone up to ask them the question. If you do run into like kind of a higher percentage of people that, your dad was in seminary when this was going on. I think that happens a ton. Like you learn yourself out or you fall more indoctrinated. Those are the only two options.
Yeah, you can't halfway it. Like,
No.
you have to learn the Greek or Hebrew.
Yeah, and then you have to do with the information that gives you. Like you just have
Yep.
to. I mean, there's choices have to be made, and so I assume that I wonder if that happens more often. But going into you're talking about transitioning. Like, how do you explore your identity in that way in a system that's so rigid and certain and defined by black and white lines? Like, what's that?
It's very, I think in some ways, because I was existing like right alongside this in the world but not of it. Like I was in an academy scene with a more strict and by other people's perception outdated gender roles
Yeah.
compared to people, like people would live in town. I remember talking to someone that had grown up going to academy, very rural boarding academy, and she left and went to public school in the next town over, and just the way the students, the way she would like talk with them, and they would be so baffled by a lot of the norms that were going on in this school like 15 miles away. And even, I, in some ways, I was both more critical of the rigid gender roles, and in other ways I felt more inherently like flawed than all the people around me. There was constant like I'm failing at like doing the womanhood thing, and as much as that is tied in with being a good Adventist, I'm therefore failing at being a good Adventist. So I was like, I know how to be a good Adventist child, but becoming a good Adventist adult means becoming a woman and getting married to a man and having children and doing all this stuff to keep up his image, because my mom was very much struggled with that as well. She is, like she's not LGBT in any way, but she just naturally fell out of typical like social norms. She was seen as a tomboy, and she always wanted that independence of having her own job, being her own person. Like, in the 80s when that was seen as like very militant and like
Yeah.
very oppositional view across the board. So she personally was like, you need to be able to do things for yourself. Like some of these gender roles just keep women from being able to like be independent. You need to be able to do these, and I don't agree with these specific things. And for a long time, I just was like identifying with that at home, and everything else was part of the chore of keeping up the Adventist mask. So, like, part of that mask was being a girl. And when the other girls were sitting around complaining about how long their skirts had to be and how much they hated that, I was like, yeah, we all hate wearing skirts. That's right. We all hate this womanhood. And it's like, no, they hated the restrictions that were being placed on them in this environment, and they wanted more independence to determine and self-define their femininity. And as I naturally tried to define myself more and more, with like teenagehood and whatnot coming on, I started to realize that like I did not identify with womanhood in any way. And for me personally, I am I identify a lot more with the label of non-binary. I'm very masculine. I think I could have maybe grown up and seen myself in a lot more masculine roles, But like again, that weirdness of being raised in Adventism, I don't know if this is aligns with yours or other people's experience, but the pocket I was in, it seemed like almost in and of itself an alternative masculinity because you weren't supposed to show competitiveness in the same way. There wasn't, you weren't
Yeah.
supposed to harm animals. I grew up in a very centered environment of like, it's, be in nature to learn about nature. Don't be in nature to kill God's creatures unnecessarily. Identify wild flowers and all this stuff. A good Christian man was more of a kind and gentle, compassionate leader who knew scripture and could, of course, be the spiritual head of the household, but he also wasn't going to go out and have a gun collection. And he wasn't going to be big into grilling because people weren't, at the very least, you weren't supposed to be pro meat and really gung ho about eating meat
Right.
where I was.
Yeah.
There was just a lot of that didn't fit with what society as a whole was showing me. This is what a good masculine man is. So from a young age, I was kind of like, yeah, I don't need to listen to that. I'm not, I'm not going to pay attention to it in that same way.
To gender norms.
Yeah. It was one of those things that it felt like a prison in general, but
Yeah.
I just did my best to like be as much as much of androgyny as I could embody. I tried to embody that, and it was mostly in like trying to prove that girls and boys weren't that different. And unfortunately, the rules were so strict gender-wise. In my Bible class in academy in high school, it came down to like there was a checklist sheet, and it was on this list of traits. Check on this side if it's a feminine trait, and check on this side if it's a masculine trait. And then at the end, it literally was just a rule of like girls become this and boys become that. And I remember like writing a paragraph thing of like, I know this is the answers I have to give to get 100 on this test, and I actually am very like, I resent the fact that I need to answer this way because in what world are boys not like, can boys not be empathetic? It was stuff like that. It was like, oh, girls are very empathetic and very soft and nurturing. And I'm like, in what world can that not be both? Like, why are we teaching this?
Yeah.
I had gotten so mad by the time I was a teenager. It was common at that time to call quote unquote the woke people social justice warriors. And I would get that comment thrown at me. And to be fair, I dived very heavily online to like by that point, the only people that I seemed to agree with. And I was kind of like full cognitive dissonance mode of like, yes, I know this is Adventism and what I'm supposed to believe, but these people online are agreeing with me about equality in different ways because this was also during 2014, the Ferguson protests. And I became very, very, like, that really captured my attention because it started to highlight a lot of issues that I'd had with the church growing up. Like a mixture of racism as, like, seeing racism somewhat on the outside, and then also just how everything was a sign of the end times. But, like, at the same time, there wasn't, like, compassion when these news stories broke. It would be like, there's so much violence. And I remember I did a prayer request instead of just like talking about the violence of the Ferguson riots. I did a prayer request, and I specifically asked for prayers for safety for the people protesting in their community. And it could have been in my imagination, but that teacher did not even call on my hand for the rest of the class period. Like it was an 80-minute like extra block class period. Like it became very clear that as soon as I said something a little bit off of what was desired, I wasn't getting that acceptance, just recognizing it as very conditional. And that allowed me to take more time to validate myself in other spaces. And I started to get very focused on like needing proof outside of myself that these things were real, so I didn't feel guilty for feeling them. Like to some point I would feel guilty for having empathy for people that were protesting on the street. People were like, well, they shouldn't be going against the police force. They shouldn't be being disorderly conduct and whatnot. And I'd be, we were told to oppose the police. Like, obviously, give unto God what is God and give unto Caesar what is Caesar and God what is God's. But suddenly all we care about is order. And like, I was very gung ho on like Jesus, like flipped over the tables, you know, he yelled at the money changers, and now we're complaining about decorum. That really got to me, and that really allowed me, the more I would validate my opinions outside of myself by like learning things about history, the more I felt like I could think that way, because I was very hung up on the conspiracy theory things.
Sure.
And so from there, it was like once I got a sense of some sort of self-assurity, then I was like, oh, I can acknowledge the fact that I'm not a woman, and I can acknowledge the fact that I relate a lot when I read about the experience of trans people online and wanting to transition. And from there, it was just determining when it was safe for me to kind of discuss those things.
So okay. So hold on. I feel like there's something there in this pivot of like, because where my brain was going with the Ferguson stuff was like for me, it was one of those moments where, like you were saying, we look at these things as, oh, this is increasing violence in the world. This is another sign of the end times. And we would always say that. And there comes this point, it did for me, where it was like, okay, that's great that this is a sign we're looking for, but what are we going to do about it? And like you said, it was like nothing. You know, like this is just happening. And when you had an opinion about what was happening, that became political, and you weren't supposed to talk about it. And it was like, well, okay, well, there's a rate. The idea that like we needed to be prepared for these things. And like in my individual life, I need to root out every bad thought and incentive or deed or whatever. I'm required to change any flaw, but I need to accept that racism, even in the church, is not going anywhere. That's a flaw God's not going to fix. And like those were the moments where I was like, something is off. Like if I if I'm supposed to do all of these things, why are we not expecting it from everyone? Like, why is it just a thing you're telling me to do, you know? And I do, that for me was like a not a start asking questions switch, but like what are the really important aspects of this to me switch. And I wonder if that kind of thing is similar of like, I need to now, I've given this thing that has shown enough, not fakeness, but give, that I should be able to explore myself further. Like if they're going to give themselves this much leeway, then how can I not give myself some leeway to figure myself out? Like that was a thing I did.
Okay.
And because I wonder, like, how do you, like, did you know what your inner conflicts were? Or was it just, I'm a tomboy? Like, did you know, when did that click for you of like, this is just.
Online mostly was, I started to, one, my dad's side is Native American. My dad is a member of the Navajo Nation.
Okay.
So I'm a tribal descendant. But I always appeared very white, and well, at the same time, I was raised with like the awareness that like you aren't just white, you also are part Native. So I stumbled across a research, like an essay overviewing two-spirit and other gender identities in the Americas with like, it was like indigenous people of the Americas and their like perceptions of gender and whatnot. And it was kind of an overview explaining it. And it was this kind of stuck. I remember I couldn't ignore the cognitive dissonance. And I felt like I had to listen, because I'm like, okay, there's a part of this that I do feel not knowledgeable about, very ignorant. I don't know that much about my Native history, and I wasn't really taught anything. And I had a complex of like feeling ignorant, felt really like I was being a bad person. I was always trying to like catch up and educate myself. I always felt like I was behind other people. So it became this thing of like, well, I need to read this and I need to understand what this is saying, even if this isn't right. I was like, I want to understand the mentality. I was always very big on that, like understanding somebody else's shoes. to kind of validate that I thought the right way often, but whatever.
Sure.
And so I read it and I kept wanting to dismiss it as like, that's foolish, the idea. Cause like I was taught very much this binaristic idea, like we all are, of like men and women. And I'm like, well, how can you even say that? Like, it'd be like adding an extra hour to the day. Like, how does that even, like, how do you change reality? But the more I was wrestling with it, I was like, there was the other part of me that's like, a good anthropologist doesn't just look into things to dismiss it. They actually need to understand the culture. And I was like, well, I can't be a bad academic, you know? So I kept just poking at that. And over time, it became very clear to me that the idea of gender being more of a social construct, and by that I mean that the society outside of, you know, physical sex characteristics, outside of hormone levels and chromosomes, a society also has other things that they tack on to what it means to be a certain gender and like what that gender is. And so I see those building blocks of like what it meant to be a man in Adventism was different than outside of Adventism. It's same as what to be a woman. And then, okay, in this other culture, one of which I come from, what it meant to be a man and woman was different too. And just all of this kind of coming to a head of like outside of the physical, just kind of like recognizing that in part of self-determination. I don't know. It was this thing that like for the longest time I didn't feel like I could articulate because I was so used to the way Adventism saw the world as very, very black and white, and like there's no room for nuance. And then because Adventism is very medical, I kind of tripped upon the like conditions referred to as like intersexuality, like encapsulating people that do not meet the physical characteristics for either man XY or woman XX, and how that is it's like a naturally occurring phenomenon, and it can come from multiple different sources of mutations or other such things, and just showing that variety a little bit and being like, oh, what I'm feeling is relating to the fact that everything itself is a spectrum. And I relate a lot more to the way the masculine role was set up from early childhood. And whatever that means to me personally, I had to figure out over those years. But there was that kind of that point of like, the more, again, learning history and stuff, the more I was like, well, these people lived this way and they weren't, I don't know, something about it being so many years ago and not being introduced to the idea of something springing up in a group didn't feel like something that, it didn't mesh with the idea of like Satan coming and tempting you. I'm like, none of it's, even in a place where I'm like, this can't be right, I was like, none of it seemed malicious. None of it even seemed like something that was ruining God's creation, which is often how it's portrayed as like sin ruined everything, which is what I'd hear as a rebuttal to like, oh, there's intersex people, maybe sex and gender aren't as binary as we think of them. They'd be like, well, that's sin. That's sin. And I'm like, sin is supposed to, you know, be reflected in the pain it causes and the cause and effect. And I'm not seeing those effects from people naturally expressing themselves and living how they see it, like their role symbolically in life.
That's interesting. A couple of things, because yes, like the two-spirit is a celebration. Like that's a celebrated status, as I understand it, in Native American culture. It was not a peculiarity necessarily.
Yes, historically, very much so.
But then also, I find it kind of interesting that like the peculiarity of Adventism itself created a spectrum of gender expression for you, just seeing how men and women in Adventist situations and outside of them are, which is a fascinating thing I've never really thought about. But like, because like femininity is a lot different in Adventism because you have less avenues to show it, because you're not supposed to wear jewelry or makeup or draw attention to yourself.
Yeah.
And so we are already shown this spectrum just from being set apart to like open up the idea of, well, all of it's a spectrum. You know, like we have confined these things over here, but by doing that, we've shown that that space is there. And I think that's beautiful that you could see that and find space to explore yourself in something you saw in Adventism as opposed to in conflict with it. I mean, I know that that's probably there too, but just in the way you worded it, it was like Adventism itself almost gave you enough room for that exploration. Not the doctrine, but just the
Yeah,
weirdness with
no,
which we interact
I
with the
agree.
world.
Yeah, there was a certain, you're supposed to be okay with people not regarding you well. And what you mentioned with femininity, and that was my experience growing up. Like, the often you would get these very strict rules. I remember one time where it like played out where you're just like entering a non-Adventist space with your Adventist peculiarities, and we're in a class trip. And so we stay at a hotel, and they're like, of course, we're going to let the kids be in the pool. Everybody go to the pool. So we have you all together. But they were like, girls and boys, you all have to wear shirts over your stuff and then shorts, even if you had a bathing suit. They were like on top of that bathing suit. And the shirt cannot be white because it will be see through,
Right.
both genders. And so all of us come out looking and feeling very different than, you know, you've got like somebody in a bikini, someone in board shorts, people that don't care, people that maybe are embarrassed about how they look, but it's not coming from a sense of like, I am being told I have to wear this, or this is immodest if I like show my belly or legs. And you're at the time, how I absorbed it was very much this kind of like, you need to be okay with people not seeing you as like being feminine enough. You know, if you're not wearing jewelry or makeup and you're keeping it toned down, people, quote unquote, of the world will see that as you being unfeminine, but they just don't value your modesty. So in that way, it kind of created this like, there's different types of women. Like there's the, honestly, like even the like the harlot of Babylon. It reminds me, like, you know, the church versus the harlot of Babylon looks so similar to me as those jokes online of like the homely girl versus the not like the like quote unquote slutty girl, the rebellious girl, and then you have the good girl on one side and the bad girl on the other. In some ways, those become a different gender role itself. And once you get stuck in being labeled the harlot, you can't put on a scarf and a maxi skirt and have people accept you as the good girl anymore, even if you do it for years often.
Yeah. Yeah. Once it's there, it's there. That's fascinating. So you're expressing, you're searching, exploring gender still in academy or still in, where are you?
Yes. This was the tail end of my boarding academy days. Like, I'm a senior, and I'm gonna be a little vague with some of the details because
Sure.
this wasn't just me alone. And I think that also what you mentioned before about being able to bounce ideas off other Adventists that are your age group, I had other people that were questioning their gender in academy settings and that I talked to. There was a couple other people I talked to that were questioning their sexuality. And I was seeing people that came from different backgrounds from my own, but very Adventist. And them discussing, it was always like, you know, like literally like it's after lights out and people are whispering their confessions to each other and talking about these things that you don't talk about in the daylight ever, and being like, it's clearly not just me, because somebody that has X, Y, and Z that I consider made me more worldly, they don't have it, and they're also feeling this way. And there were several times where I think that allowed me to, like, I think it was really just beneficial for my mental health at the time to have those taboo conversations, because this was happening before gay marriage was even legalized in the US. Like 2014, it was like right before I graduated, right before in 2015 it passed. So it was just one of those things of like, well, it's not just illegal here, it's illegal everywhere. Was kind of the perception or the feeling. So yeah, it was a lot of those discussions made the difference, and I think really pushed me over the edge to like, I'm not gonna go to Adventist University. I already didn't want to go because of the control element in academy and how strict it was. I had already been taking other issues with the Adventist system, but I was like, I can't go there. I was like, I'm going to go away to college and then I'm going to live my truth, you know. And I was fully under this idea that I would need to get my own place and be independent, separate from my parents, because I knew that it went against Adventism. And I knew someone else that started to live as a trans person, and their family made it extremely difficult and tried to put them into conversion therapy, tried to get the church as a whole in on it. It was a lot of stuff where I was like, oh, this could spiral really bad, and you can lose all autonomy and all community if you don't, like, if you let too much slip. So I was just prepared to kind of like separate, and then I could separate from the church because I didn't feel like I could assert, like, I don't want to go to church as I was still living at home with my mom. Like, as soon as I was going to leave academy, I was going to go back home and would be expected to still, you know, exist as an Adventist.